Hi everybody, so this is going to be lesson 9.1. We're going to be covering pretty much most of the 1980s in this lesson and focusing largely on Reagan's administration and the end of the Cold War. So first thing that we're going to look at is Ronald Reagan and the rise of the neoconservatives in the 1980s. So you don't need to necessarily put all of this to memory, but this is just to give you some idea as far as how the two political parties have evolved since they've kind of originally come around. At this point, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have pretty much flip-flopped their positions from their original founding, and they much more reflect the parties that we are familiar with today. So the Liberal or Democratic Party is going to be looking to regulate big business, that they are going to support high taxes on the wealthy. They are going to want to have a lot of social programs and a social safety net that is going to be helping the disadvantaged. The Conservative Party, specifically the Republican Party, is going to be looking at a much more restricted use of federal funds for things like social programs. They're not going to feel that that's where the country's money should go. It should be going to things like fighting the Soviets in the Cold War. They also are going to be moving more towards a social conservatism that is going to focus largely on religious faith being a very large part of their side of the movement. So we're going to look at kind of how this conservative movement is going to take hold. And we start with the new right. So first off, we got to look at where this is going to be coming from. So the new right is going to start to arise because of a lot of the turmoil that's happening socially in the country. Things like the civil rights movement, the counterculture. It's going to make people fearful for the future and feel like there is some loss of our moral identity. There's also a lot of faith that's been lost in traditional authority because of the lies that have been revealed regarding Vietnam or the Watergate scandal. There's going to be definitely a lot of people who feel that there needs to be some morality brought back to our politics. And then we also had the stagflation of the 1970s is causing people a lot of economic fears. They're feeling like the period of American prosperity that they had seen in the 1950s is now very quickly dwindling, and they want to hold on to it as best they can. So what is this quote-unquote new right? Well, their beliefs are very strong anti-communism, so there's going to be a very strong stance against the Soviet Union and against communism in Europe and around the world, that they are going to be in favor of free market economics. They're going to be kind of going along with that laissez-faire economics, very similar to what we saw from the Gilded Age. And they are going to add in something that has not really been in here before, and that is going to be religious traditionalism, going back to this idea that the country was founded on Christian ideals, and so we need to get back to those traditions. So they believed that a lot of the liberal programs that have been created under LBJ and things like this had been counterproductive in fighting poverty as well as stimulating economic growth. They said, it's just as bad as it was before this very expensive program. It has restricted the economy. The economy is now getting worse because the government is spending just too much money. And so the guy that's going to be the kind of poster person for this is going to be Barry Goldwater, who we see in the picture on the right. Barry Goldwater is going to run for the Republican Party against Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964, just following JFK's assassination. And Barry Goldwater is going to outline these new ideas in his book called The Conscience of a Conservative. He's really the first true conservative to be nominated since World War II. Now, in this book, he outlines really the reasons why he feels that that faith and traditionalism and free market are going to be things that make the country better, that are going to improve the status of Americans. And he's going to get some support from a well-known celebrity, a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan, who is actually going to join into the conservative movement with Goldwater in a speech that's known as A Time for Choosing. In this, Ronald Reagan is going to be attacking the New Deal state, saying that it spent too much money, saying that the problem with the Republican Party, as he saw it, was that Eisenhower had basically been too liberal. Eisenhower had done too much to support civil rights and to increase the social safety net for the economically disadvantaged. And he also said that containment had been too timid in the face of communism, essentially saying that, you know, if we really want to defeat communism, we have to do it head on. He warned that, quote, if we trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state, that the nation would take the first step into 1,000 years of darkness, unquote. Now, this is kind of interesting because up to this point, Ronald Reagan had actually been a staunch Democrat. And we'll go over kind of where his change comes in just a few moments. During this period of time, so this is the mid to late 1960s, we're also going to see the emergence of new right think tanks, ones like the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute. And their whole job, their whole reason for being is figuring out ways to get conservatives elected to Congress, elected to the presidency, as well as on the federal court system. And this is to ensure that those conservative ideals are going to continue forward. So who is going to be part of this new right? Well, the first of these is going to be the religious right. And this is going to be a new movement that we have not seen previously, but it definitely has some throwbacks to like the period of fundamentalism that we saw in the 1920s. So first of all, the religious right is going to be made up of people who feel that the country is morally going down the tubes because of all this liberalism, because of civil rights, because of the sexual revolution, because of the LGBT movement, because of all of those civil rights movements that occur in the 1960s and 1970s. And these individuals are going to be evangelicals. Now, we've talked about evangelism before, which is this idea that it is your job as a Christian not just to believe, but to also spread the word to other people and to encourage their conversion. But there's going to be a new term going along with this, that they are quote unquote born again Christians. And what that essentially means is that that they are encouraging people to convert and to be quote unquote born again into the religion. And it is going to be very much like the fundamentalist movement of the 1920s, going to be based on a literal interpretation of the Bible and also something new, political activism. And so they are going to label themselves as being part of what is called the moral majority. They believed that the majority of Americans were fearful that American society had lost touch with its traditional values. We had been limiting prayer in public schools. There was a growing number of single mothers. Young people were rebelling against authority. There was the ERA movement and so on and so forth. And so they said that the majority of Americans did believe in this morality, but they had been silenced because they felt that there had needed to be this separation of church and state. But now, under the leadership of people like Billy Graham, who had been popularized as a televangelist in the 1950s, as well as Pat Robertson and the guy you see in the picture here, Jerry Falwell, these people are going to be leading this moral majority movement, this religious right. And they are going to be saying that it is actually essential for American Christian churches to be promoting their ideals within politics, because the only way for us to protect a moral society is through the ballot box. And so they are actually preaching not just scripture, but also policy from the pulpit. The next group that we're going to be seeing that's going to join the new right is going to be people from the Sun Belt. We've kind of talked about the Sun Belt a little bit before. These are people that are living in the southern part of the United States. It's called the Sun Belt because it's generally sunny there most of the time, has good weather, and it has increasingly drawn more and more and more people since the 1920s because of things like the invention of air conditioning, which makes the summers livable, to the wide open spaces that allows for lots of new homes to be built, as well as these are going to be places where a lot of those industrial centers are going to be during World War I and World War II, which also adds to this massive population growth. But what that also does then in return is that it increases these states' electoral power. California becomes the most populous state in the nation and has the most electoral power. Texas is going to be in second place because, you know, there's all those wide open spaces there. And the people that are living in the Sun Belt don't like high taxes. They don't like federal regulations that are interfering with this growth that is happening there. For example, Westerners are going to resent the federal environmental regulations that are restricting the development of the nation's or the region's natural resources and being able to build new factories out there. White Southerners, on the other hand, are going to be turning to Republican conservatism as a result of the civil rights movement. So there is going to be definitely an electoral shift. There is going to be also a power shift coming into this area. And by 1980, the population of the Sun Belt had surpassed the Northeast, giving these conservative regions of the country more electoral votes. The final one of these is going to be the suburbs. People who are living in places like our town in Eastvale. White flight is going to be part of the cause of this. We've talked about it before, where white people are going to flee the cities because they are fearful of the quote-unquote darkening of their cities. And so as more and more white families who are middle class and have more money and thus have a higher tax bracket move into the suburbs, they are now going to have more money out there. They're going to have better schools, etc. But they don't want to have high taxes. They feel like with stagflation, their buying power has been reduced, and so the average middle class family is not making any more money, but their taxes are getting higher. And the place where all this is going to reach its apex is right in our own backyard of Orange County, California, where they are going to be fighting Proposition 13, or fighting for Prop 13. So Prop 13 was a state referendum that would greatly reduce property taxes. It said that property taxes would only be allowed to go up by a maximum of 2% each year. Now, the reason that this was such a big deal is that the houses that were being built in Orange County were becoming much, much, much more desirable, which means that the value of the property would go up, and so the city would be able, and the state would be able to tax that property at a higher rate because the value is going up. That meant that a family that's living on that property is now paying a higher and higher and higher tax in the same house that they not necessarily are making any more money on until they actually sell the house. As well as because of stagflation, these people are feeling like they're not bringing in any more money and their taxes are getting higher. So Prop 13 would limit how high those property taxes could go up each year. And because of this massive conservative push in Orange County, that is now going to become law here in California, and it still is the law. Now, once that happens in Orange County, suburbs across the nation are going to realize the power that they have, and they're going to use that to their advantage. So let's talk about Ronald Reagan and his rise to being the poster boy of the Conservative Party. Like I said, Ronald Reagan was originally an actor, but before that, he's actually a California boy. He was an actor, a football star, and he actually had been the president of the Screen Actors Guild, or the Actors Union in Hollywood. And he ended up actually testifying against Hollywood in front of HUAC. He didn't like that there were so many communists within Hollywood. And when he was brought in front of HUAC and said, you know, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party of the United States? He said, no, I have not, but I know who is. And he was willing to name names. And he did this because he felt that it was a threat to the American society to have these communists within Hollywood. Because of this popular background that he has, for example, not only being in movies, but also being the spokesperson for General Electric Theater, which was a weekly TV series, he is going to be just a household name. And during this period of time, he has been moving further and further and further away from the Democratic Party that he had once been such a huge proponent of. He had been a big proponent of FDR and the New Deal during the 1930s. But by the time that we're hitting the 1950s and into the 1960s, he really is getting frustrated with the Democratic Party and how they have moved so far to the left. And so that's when he joins up with Barry Goldwater, and he is also going to be deciding to run for California's governor position. And he says that by doing this, he is going to, quote unquote, clean up the mess in Berkeley, which was referring to the campus radicals that were protesting for free speech. He would serve as the governor of California from 1967 to 1975. He promoted a limited government. He lowered taxes. He was also very tough with law and order. And although he was older already, he was just eternally youthful. He had this very folksy personality, and people really liked him. And so because of this, the Republican Party is going to figure out that this guy is a great face for this new conservatism. He is a great public speaker. Like I said, that folksy attitude and personality makes people just drawn to him. And so they decide that that's going to be their guy for the next presidential election in 1980. So President Carter is going to be running for re-election with his running mate, Vice President Walter Mondale. And then Ronald Reagan is going to be running for the Republican Party. Now, Reagan is going to have a few things to his benefit. First of all, Carter has historically low approval ratings, and a lot of this has to do with stagflation, as well as the failed attempts to release the hostages in Iran, as well as his ideas were definitely a little bit ahead of their time, I think we would say. Reagan is going to run on this very conservative platform, and the quote-unquote Reagan coalition, or group of people that are going to really be supportive of him, are corporate elites who are going to benefit from his promise to lower taxes and to and the new right, because he says that he wants to bring morality back to the government. And if you're looking at his campaign poster and you're seeing a very recognizable slogan, that is not a mistake. Donald Trump did take that same slogan of Make America Great Again because he was trying to make a comparison between himself and Ronald Reagan. Both of them had little to no executive experience. Both of them had a background in television and in movies. Both of them were these kind of populist presidents and or populist candidates. And so he was essentially trying to say, like, hey, you guys liked Reagan, and Reagan didn't have, you know, all those, you know, quote unquote traditional and establishment background. So take the same, you know, take the same bet with me. So that's kind of where that comes about. And his other big slogan that came out in one of his campaign debates was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And most Americans, they couldn't say that they were better off than they were 4 years ago. Now, his other campaign slogan is that it's morning again in America. And this was also trying to give a very positive perspective of when Reagan is elected, things are going to be bright again. People are going to feel like things are hopeful and that there is good coming in the future. And so as Reagan takes over, he is going to be focusing largely on the economy, and this is going to be known as Reaganomics. Now, Reaganomics is basically what we've already seen happen back in the 1920s under the Republican presidents with Andrew Mellon as the Secretary of the Treasury. This is going to be supply-side economics or trickle-down economics. It is going to be tax cuts for the wealthy with this idea that it is going to trickle down to the masses. It also is going to increase interest rates as a way to target inflation, to make sure that inflation didn't run away too fast once people had more money in their pockets. However, everybody was saying, well, in order to make these tax cuts, you have to cut some of these really expensive programs like Social Security and Medicare. But he decides to actually preserve those programs because they are so incredibly popular amongst the masses. And so because of this, he actually preserves Social Security and Medicare for these political reasons. While he's doing this, he also is going to increase the spending for defense. And I'll go into that in more detail in just a minute. But he's doing this in order to combat against the spread of communism. And because of this, he is spending more money than he is actually bringing in. That's why the government brings in taxes, is so that they can use it to spend on important items, things like Social Security and Medicare and defense spending. And so because he's spending more than he brings in, there's going to be a lot of very vocal criticism. People who are saying that, number one, it didn't trickle down the last time, it's not going to trickle down this time. And there's also people who are saying that, you know, if you're spending all of this money, like, that's going to hurt the deficit. That is going to increase the federal deficit. And they were not wrong. In fact, there was a $200 billion loss of federal revenue over 5 years, and it increased the federal deficit 3 times what it had been prior to his administration. So it went from $930 billion to over $2.8 trillion. And his arguments against that is, he said, look, defense is not a budget item. You have to spend what you need. So what is his economy actually going to look like? Well, first of all, he is going to deregulate transportation. This is an idea of getting rid of some of the laws and some of the rules when it comes to transportation in order to increase competition. It did lead to some price wars. There were cheaper fares, and there were new airlines that were being founded. He also cut funding for the EPA as well as OSHA to increase competition. And so there is going to be, you know, some benefit that comes from this. However, in the long run, it is going to cause some problems because it is going to environmentally have some serious repercussions. There is also a decline in manufacturing, and this is not necessarily Reagan's fault. This is something that's been coming for a while. First of all, we're just not making stuff anymore. We are a service sector economy. And because of that, that means that people need more education to get these jobs that are in the service sector, and that's not necessarily readily available to all people. That means that people who are traditionally in the manufacturing industry are going to be losing their jobs. We also see a decline of union membership, and this goes hand in hand with the decline in manufacturing. Union membership has always been highest in blue-collar jobs, whereas with the service sector, you don't really see a lot of unionization. And so because of this, there is also going to be more of a disparity that's going to come when it comes to how employees are treated. In fact, there is going to be a stagnation of wages. People are not going to be making any real more money. And also because of this, the wage gap is going to increase exponentially because of those tax cuts that went for the wealthy. So people like CEOs and the just kind of traditionally wealthy in America, they are going to be making more and more and more money, whereas the average American, because of the decline of union membership, because of the decline in manufacturing, are just not going to see those dollars. It's going to go to those at the very, very, very top. And the wage gap today is the worst it has ever been in American history. However, there is going to be a lot of new businesses that are going to be created. There are going to be new jobs that are going to be created. They're just not going to be in the places where they've been previously. And so what that's going to make is that there's going to be a gap in the American public as to the jobs that are available are not necessarily the jobs that Americans have the training for. Next thing, kind of related to foreign policy but not, is going to be the space race. And one thing that we have done is we have finally created a reusable space shuttle. Up to this point, the space shuttles that we have used have been one single time use. We shoot them up, they do their thing, and when they come down, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. So now that we have something that is reusable, kind of similar to an airplane, that is going to save us a lot of money. We are going to be sending the first space shuttle, which was the Columbia, up into space in 1981. However, even though the space race continues and we are trying to inspire new movements in space, there is going to be a major tragedy with the explosion of the Challenger on January 28, 1986. This broke apart 73 seconds into its flight, leading to the deaths of all 7 crew members. But what was really even more tragic about this was that it was being watched live by people across America, especially school children, because Krista McAuliffe, the first female teacher that was to go into space, was on board. And so this led to a lot of questions by Americans of should we or should we not continue the space race? And it is definitely something that has come into question even still today. The space race even today is something that has had declining funding from the government since the 1980s. And Reagan in many ways does have a contested legacy. On the conservative side, they love him. He is just a larger than life figure. He is, he has just been lauded as this, this icon of, of conservatism. However, on the more liberal side, people see him as way more moderate than the Conservative Party paints him out to be, but also that they feel that he did a lot more damage than what he did that was beneficial. And a lot of that is going to center around his policies of Reaganomics as well as his actions in the Cold War, which is what we're going to look at next. So the Cold War is going to begin to thaw during Reagan's presidency, but it doesn't start out that way. So when it comes to the Cold War, Reagan is going to take a much stronger stance than what we've seen under Nixon and Carter. And we can see this in the Reagan Doctrine. In this, he says that the United States is going to support guerrilla groups that are trying to overthrow communist or pro-Soviet governments. And we are going to be getting involved in a lot of smaller nations through these kind of proxy wars around the globe. A great example of this is the invasion of Grenada, where U.S. Marines were going to be sent into Grenada to quote-unquote protect American interests, but reality is that we are there to help support rebels who are trying to overthrow a Marxist or communist regime. And another great example, and probably the most significant or well-known of all these, is going to be the Iran-Contra scandal. This is going to be a secret deal that is an arms for hostages deal that we have with Iran. So this gets really kind of confusing, but the way that this goes is that we wanted to get weapons to a Nicaraguan rebel group known as Contras, who were trying to overthrow a pro-Soviet government there. However, we needed to do that in a way that the American people didn't know that we were using their hard-earned tax dollars to give to this rebel group. So what they ended up doing is they made this secret arms for hostages deal with Iran. Now, we already had an embargo against Iran at this point. And so making any deals with them was not going to be very positive amongst the American people because of the hostage situation that we had had. And so what we did with them is that we essentially agreed to give them some of their hostages, some of the people that we had as hostages or as detainees, and then they would give us money as a result. Then we would use that money to then give a bunch of weapons to the Nicaraguan Contras. Now, this eventually does become public information. And the guy you see up at the top right, that is Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who is on the National Security Council. And he and other NSC, as well as CIA officials, admitted to covering up their actions, including going as far as shredding documents and destroying evidence when he was questioned in front of Congress. Now, within all of this, Reagan is going to be implicated. Everybody's going to be saying, well, how much did the president know? How much did the president know? And it's going to become clear that Reagan, at least to a certain extent, had some knowledge of what was happening. However, he's never tried. And part of that comes from this statement that essentially Reagan said, do what you need to do in order to get this done. And so he had enough of that kind of deniability that he was left alone, which gave him a nickname of the Teflon president, because nothing seemed to stick to him. So these are some good examples of kind of the Cold War starting to rise, and we really see a lot more of this focused on the Soviet Union itself. In fact, there's going to be a massive, massive buildup of military arsenal. We are going to restart the arms race, and we are going to put more money into it than ever before. And one of the things that Reagan is going to, or why Reagan is going to be doing this, is because Reagan sees the Soviet Union as, quote unquote, the evil empire. That kind of language, that kind of terminology is going to obviously lead to some pretty unfavorable feelings between us and the Soviet Union. But what it also does is it explains to the American people why he wants to spend $2 trillion, basically a quarter of the national budget, on more nuclear weapons. And one of the ways that he is going to try to combat against the Soviets' expansion of their nuclear weapons is through the Strategic Defense Initiative, abbreviated to SDI, but it would earn the unfortunate nickname of Star Wars. And the reason it gets this nickname is because it was calling for the development of weapons that would be able to intercept incoming missiles. So essentially, if they shot a nuclear weapon at us, we would have these satellites in space that could shoot off a laser that would destroy the nuke in space before it got to America. And if that sounds like something that you saw in a sci-fi movie, you would pretty much be correct, because we didn't have that technology. And so that's why it got the nickname of Star Wars, is that it was seen as kind of ridiculous and out of this world as the things you see in sci-fi movies. He is going to try, as a way to reduce the tensions, to have the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, also known as START, which would have limited our nuclear weapons. However, what it allowed him to do was it allowed him to put more money into our traditional sea and air-based weaponry. So in this sense, even though it sounds like we're reducing the number of nuclear weapons, it does allow for Reagan to spend more money on those more traditional forms of weapons. So how does this all start to actually cool down? Well, one of the first things is that the alliance between China and the Soviet Union dissolved around the 1970s. They also had tried to catch the United States in its military buildup, and that had tanked the Soviet economy. They didn't have the money that we did. And throughout the 1960s and 1970s, when Americans are fighting for greater civil rights and greater equality and more opportunities for free speech, the Soviet Union was maintaining a very tight control and a lot of censorship. And because of this, it's going to lead to revolts in many of the satellite nations. There was going to be revolts in Hungary. There was a revolt in Czechoslovakia. There would be one in Poland. These revolts are going to show the discontent of the people living in the nations controlled by the Soviet Union with the way that things are running. They want to have more freedom and more democracy. And that is when a new premier is going to be elected. And that is going to be Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev is going to be elected in 1988, and he is going to be introducing some ideas that are really, really out there for the Soviet Union. Now, he's young, he is enthusiastic, he is he had grown up after the Stalin generation. So that means that he didn't like the idea of the people of the Soviet Union being scared of their government. And he was a very skilled politician and was able to get several new ideals put forth in the Soviet Union that would never have happened before. The first of these is glasnost. It means openness, and it allowed for the free flow of ideas and information between the government and the people. It was basically eliminating a lot of the censorship and the secretiveness that was happening within the government. We also had perestroika, which was an economic restructuring that was, think of it as kind of like diet capitalism, where they were going to allow some capitalism. They were going to allow some private ownership. They were going to allow some people or some industries to make and mark their own prices. This was designed in order to help stimulate the economy that had very much stagnated. They were needing to do something that was going to kickstart that economy. And then the last of these is democratization. This was calling for the election of a new legislative body, and rather than the voters just merely approving of those that had been appointed by the Communist Party, the people were actually going to get to choose who they actually wanted as their representatives. This was pretty revolutionary, and if you've ever read the book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, you know that if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk. And once he gets a glass of milk, he's going to need a napkin. And once he gets a napkin, he's going to want a straw, and so on and so forth. Well, if you give a commie freedom, they're going to want some more. And so with this, he is going to make really big strides to try and cooperate with the United States, because he sees that as a positive impact for his country, because they do need to get their economy moving. And one of the best ways we see this is with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty. This was going to ban the intermediate range nuclear weapons, so basically the ones that had ranges of 300 to 3,400 miles. So essentially, you would be able to use very, very short range nuclear weapons or extremely long range nuclear weapons. But the idea is that we were going to try to ban these mid-range missiles that did not give countries enough time to respond, nor did they give the countries enough time to hopefully avoid this kind of weaponry. And so what this did is it eliminated the nukes that were held in Europe. And we agreed to this as long as the Soviets had withdrawn from Afghanistan, which I will actually talk about in a future lesson. So Reagan sees this as an opportunity to have a very strong stance against communism, against the Soviet Union, against Gorbachev. And he is slated to go give a speech at the 750th anniversary of the city of Berlin. He's going to be speaking at the Brandenburg Gate, which was this historic and iconic symbol of Berlin. However, it landed squarely on the eastern Berlin side, and so it was just this very great example of the division of the city. And in this speech that he gave in 1987, Ronald Reagan challenges Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. He wanted to encourage a more freedom in the Eastern Bloc, and not long afterwards, the wall does come down, only about a year and a half later, but it comes down in a really unforeseen way. So some East German politicians were giving a speech where they were explaining that the wall would be opened to some people for some cross-border movement, mainly for economic reasons. Basically, they were going to allow some people to get passes to go get jobs on the western side so that it would bring more money to the eastern side. Except for this low-level Eastern German politician who is talking about this on TV says that the wall will open at, X time on X day, and totally blanks on the caveat of but only for some people. And when people hear about this, they think that that means it's open for everybody, and so people start crowding around the wall and they want to see if this is actually going to happen. And more and more and more people show up, and the East German guards are very nervous because they've been trained that if there's too many people or if they get too close to the wall, you shoot first and you ask questions later. But there's just too many of them, and they call up their leadership and they say, we need your help. What are we supposed to do? And they are being told, well, put down the crowds. And they're like, there's way more of them than there are of us. And so for their own personal safety, they decide that they are going to open up the wall. Now, Russia has been told of this, and the Soviet military is ready to roll in on the gate. However, they get there after these East German guards, in their fear, have already opened it up. And so once the gate was open, there was no closing it again. And people started to celebrate. They started to jump up on the wall itself, and they started afterwards tearing the wall down themselves with their own bare hands. And it was an absolutely beautiful and joyous moment for people to see this city that had been separated for 40 years almost, suddenly come down. Families being reunited, friends seeing each other for the first time in so many decades, and just the sense that there was a freedom of movement that they had not seen for many, many decades. And this is all that's left of the Berlin Wall today. And you might be noticing there's no wall, and that's on purpose. The only part that has been left behind is the military checkpoint, known as Checkpoint Charlie. This is the place where we had that really tense standoff with the Soviet Union under President Kennedy, and it had been the most tense point on the wall because it was that one open spot in the wall between the East and West. Today, the wall has been torn down, and you can't really tell the difference between what was West Berlin and what wasn't, except for the pictures that are located on top of the building. Whatever face you see, whether it is on the left-hand side an American soldier or on the right-hand side an East German soldier, that shows you what side you were looking at. So if you're looking at the side that has an American soldier, you're standing on the East German side looking towards West Berlin. And if you are looking at the East German soldier, you're standing on the side of West Berlin looking towards East Berlin. Today, this is now the location of the Berlin Wall Museum and the Cold War Museum. So I highly recommend that if you get a chance to watch the video that is linked to this image, and I will also link it up on our class website. It's a short little video that tells us kind of just the short history of the Cold War. However, ladies and gentlemen, the way that a lot of people see this is that the Cold War was 40 years of us standing eye to eye with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union blinked first. So the final thing that we have is about the culture of the 1980s. There's not a lot that I've seen on the College Board talking about this, but I just want to go over a few things that kind of have come up. First of all, there is going to be a massive expansion of music and American popular culture around the world due to things like television, and specifically MTV. Music television, which I know they don't play a lot of music on MTV anymore. It's mostly, some kind of reality show. But back in the day, that is all that they did, was show music videos. And it's really iconic because it is the first television station that is geared entirely towards young people. High school and college age is their demographic. And so this was something that had not been done before, and it was something that was very exciting. This is how young people got their news. I will tell you that this is how I got my news growing up. I wasn't watching, Channel 2 or Channel 7, watching the news, at night. I was watching Kurt Loder tell me what was happening on MTV News every day. So MTV News was really a cultural shift that we see as being similar to what we had seen in the 1950s for teenagers as far as things like American Bandstand. So when I've seen something like this come up on the AP exam, it's generally making that kind of comparison. The other thing that we're going to see is in the 1980s, there is an obsession with money. The economy starts to pick up, but it really picks up for those that are already at the top and those that are involved in finance and banking and business. Wall Street is booming, real estate is booming. So if you are an average everyday manufacturer, if you work in the auto industry, you are not seeing these major, this major cash flow. But if you are working on Wall Street, if you are, a real estate mogul like this young guy by the name of Donald Trump, you are seeing money come in and you are bringing it in hand over fist. This is going to be idealized in movies and television. So for example, there is the movie Wall Street, where the tagline of that movie is "Greed is good." And that just kind of, in just a nutshell, tells you what the 1980s economic philosophy was. Do whatever you have to do in order to make more money than the other guy. And then down below that, we have the television show, The Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, starring Robin Leach. And in this, he would show you the houses of the people who were rich and famous. This was the original like MTV Cribs kind of thing. And with the lifestyles of the rich and famous, not only were you just so sad and depressed by how the world looked and how sad it was because you didn't have these fabulous things, but he would always sign off with, "And I wish you champagne wishes and caviar dreams." And this was very much an ideal or a goal for a lot of Americans. We're also going to see a little bit of revival of environmentalism. Not a ton, but there is going to be some. And that is largely going to come from a massive, massive disaster known as the Exxon Valdez oil spill. This was an oil tanker that spilled a ton of oil off of the Pacific coast, North Pacific coast, and it dropped off so much oil that, you could see that oil spill from space. It killed off tons of wildlife, and this was being shown on the news every night, that it was in National Geographic, it was on the cover of Time magazine. This was something that you couldn't avoid, and people were realizing that some of the deregulation was what that we had seen under Carter and under Reagan was what was responsible for this. For example, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker had already had some issues when it came to its safety and its structure, but because there weren't as strict of rules about that because of deregulation, it was allowed to continue operating, and that's what caused the oil spill. Was it that the structure of the boat itself failed, and so this is going to cause for new calls for environmentalism and stricter regulations. And then finally, the most important event that happened in the 1980s, I was born. So everything that we're talking about from this point forward is going to be things that you and I in some way are probably pretty familiar with. And so I know that some of it will seem a little repetitive because you're like, yes, I know what the internet is, or yes, I know who, George W. Bush is. But it's going to be important that you guys are paying close attention because these come up on the AP exam largely as a way to make a comparison to previous events that we have discussed in this class. So with that said, I will sign off and I will see you guys next time for the 1990s.